For this project, I'm building a coffee table for my office. While trying to come up with an idea of what I wanted my coffee table to look like, I was looking around on the internet and stumbled upon Rogue Engineer's industrial coffee table. I liked it a lot, so I decided to base mine heavily off of what he had designed. If you are interested in seeing what Rogue Engineer's coffee table looks like, I'll include a link in the description below. As much as I liked Rogue Engineer's coffee table design, I did end up changing several things so that I could meet my own requirements that I set for this project. Over the last several months, I've been intentionally trying to build projects that can use as much wood from my wood project pile as possible. So one of my requirements for this project was to use up as many 2x4s as possible, since I have a lot of 2x4s on hand. That's why you'll notice that all these 2x4s I'm working with, they've all already been stained because they've been recycled from a previous project. Although almost every 2x4 I used for this project was already stained, it was not the color I wanted for this project. So I ended up having to sand almost every piece down to the point to remove the stain completely, and then I was able to restain with the color I wanted, which was teak. As I stain the frame pieces, I'll talk about some of the changes I made to Rogue Engineer's plans. One of the big things I knew right from the start I was going to end up changing was that Rogue used various sizes of wood from 1x2s up to 1x8s to be able to make his top and bottom shelves. For mine, I wanted to just use 2x4s because I wanted to use up as many 2x4s as possible, and I have a fair amount of smaller 2x4 scraps on hand. The next big change was the size of the coffee table. Rogue's was 18 inches tall with 27 by 51 inches. Now, the 18 inches tall part worked fine for me. That's a good height for a coffee table. But 27 by 51 was too big for the space I wanted to put it in, and it was going to look oversized compared to the daybed that it was going to be in front of, where it would be used as a coffee table for. So I ended up reducing mine down to 19 by 38. Now the length I settled on for the coffee table was ultimately determined because I wanted to use 2x4s for the top and bottom shelf of the table. I knew I wanted the length of the coffee table to be between 30 and 40 inches long, so it would be proportional to the length of a daybed. Ultimately the number was settled on 38 because it allowed me to do 10 rows of 2x4s side by side, creating a full length of 35, and then the 1.5 inches for each of the framework pieces, giving me 38 total. My next major change came with the assembly of the frame. To assemble my frame, I ended up using pocket holes, but the original plan by Rogue requires using strong ties. Although I like the look of the strong ties used on Rogue Engineer's coffee table, and it's the main reason why he calls it an industrial coffee table, it simply didn't meet one of my other requirements for this project, which was to spend as little money as possible. The strong tie kit that Rogue Engineer used for his coffee table is going for about $38. So I decided to just stick with the pocket holes since I already had the screws on hand and it wouldn't cost me anything. In fact, I only ended up spending like $5 total on this project because I had to go buy some stain applicator pads. After I had fully assembled the frame, I started cutting the pieces for my top and bottom shelf. Now I purposely waited to cut these pieces till after the frame was assembled so I could get a precise measurement from the inside of the frame. I already knew what sizes these pieces should be since I had drawn up the entire coffee table in SketchUp in advance before I even started this project. But what you draw up in the computer does not translate to actually cutting things in real life. The last thing I wanted to do was cut all these pieces at the beginning only to assemble the frame and find that something was too big and it was binding because I cut a framework piece too small. Another thing I changed is Rogue Engineer used 3/4 inch plywood as the base for his top and bottom shelf. All of his scrap pieces that essentially were the surface of the shelf were attached to the 3/4 inch plywood. I swapped out the 3/4 inch plywood and used 3/8 inch beadboard because I had quite a bit of beadboard scrap on hand, and ultimately it was going to work better with how I intended to mount my bottom and top shelf to my frame. In order to support the top and bottom shelves of the coffee table once dropped into place, I had to attach 3 2x4s to the top and bottom parts of the frame using pocket hole screws. Rogue Engineer used some metal right angle brackets to attach his top and bottom shelves to his frame, and while this went with his industrial style look, I wanted to use 2x4s because it met my requirements for use as much wood up as possible and spend as little money as possible. Now that my 2x4 support pieces were in place, I was able to lay the beadboard into the table and then start laying out the 2x4 scrap pieces that would actually make up the surface of my top and bottom shelf. While I did have some 2x4 scraps that I could use as the surface of the top and bottom shelf, I didn't have enough to do the entire area, so I started taking some of my other 2x4s that were a little bit longer and just kind of cutting them randomly to help fill in some of the gaps initially. Once I had about 30 pieces of 2x4 cut to random sizes, I started to lay them out until I created 10 partial rows. And once I was happy with those pieces in their placement, I then started to come back and measure the gap that remained for each row, and then I cut a 2x4 specific to that location and then dropped it in place. Once all my pieces were cut to fit, I pulled everything out and did a light sanding on the beadboard and all the 2x4 pieces to clean up all the edges, especially where they had been cut. I then dropped the beadboard pieces back into the frame and put the 2x4 pieces back into their respective spots. At this point, I was ready to attach the 2x4 pieces to the beadboard. First, I removed one row of 2x4s in order to be able to shift all the other rows down. Then I started to apply glue to the beadboard. Then I was able to shift the 2x4s back into their correct positions as I went row by row until I was able to finally reinsert the final row that had been removed and glue it down. You may notice as I'm gluing the pieces down for the bottom shelf that a couple of the rows are actually made up of 3 pieces per row, not 2. I only did this on the bottom shelf to be able to use up some more of the scrap and to avoid cutting more of my longer pieces, but a top shelf is all 2 2x4 pieces per row. Once I was done with the bottom shelf, I simply repeated this process for the top. I did start to apply glue to the sides of the 2x4 pieces as well as to the bottom so that they would glue themselves to the row next to them and to the beadboard itself. I didn't end up doing this for maybe the first 4 or 5 rows on the bottom shelf because I just didn't think about it at the time, but once I started doing that process, I did it for all the other rows after that. After waiting overnight for the glue to fully dry and set, I came back out the next day, removed the shelves from the frame, and then put them on my work table. To flip them over just to make sure I wouldn't lose a 2x4 in case something wasn't fully set down with the glue, I used a 3/4 inch plywood to squeeze the 2x4s between the 3/4 inch plywood and the beadboard, and then I flipped over the entire thing. At that point, I used a triangle to mark off where each row was, and then used my nail gun to send some 1.25 inch long nails into the 2x4s to secure them in place. After setting multiple nails into each of the 2x4s, I then gave the beadboard a quick light sanding. Next, I flipped the whole thing over so I could sand all the 2x4 so I could remove the old stain so I could apply the new stain and have the correct color at the end. I also wanted to do it this way where I was sanding the entire thing as one unit so that if any of the 2x4s were slightly uneven, I could smooth out those surfaces with the sander so that when you ran your hand across it, everything would feel nice and smooth and level. Once the top and bottom shelves were fully sanded and I gave them a good vacuuming to clean off all the dust, I then was ready to stain them. So I started with staining the beadboard portion of the shelf, and then once it dried, I flipped it over and finished by staining the 2x4s. Once the stain had fully dried, I was ready to put the shelves back into the frame. In order to get them out originally, after I had wood glued all the pieces down to the beadboard, I did have to loosen some of the frame pieces by unscrewing some of the pocket holes, just backing them off a little bit in order to get the shelves out because they were fairly tight in there. So as I put it back together, I had to go back and tighten down some of those pocket hole screws. That is it for my coffee table project that was inspired by Rogue Engineers Industrial Coffee Table. I hope you guys like this video, and I'll see you next time on the DIY Grunt.